I want to discuss the concept of buying on margin. When you buy on margin, securities are purchased with money borrowed in part from the broker. What this does is it provides leverage that magnifies the gains and losses because the percentage return is based on the amount of money you invest. So, for a fixed amount of money, you can actually own more shares of the stock. In order to understand this, we've got a couple of definitions we need to go through. The initial margin requirement. This is the minimum percentage initial investor equity that the investor has to have. Equity is defined as the value of the security minus the borrowing. The minimum is set by the Federal Reserve under Regulation T, and it's currently 50% for stocks. Now, 1 minus this initial margin requirement is the maximum percentage amount that can be borrowed. So if you saw 100% margin, what this means is you can't borrow money to purchase securities. It has to be a cash transaction. 0% margin, on the other hand, means you don't have to have any equity in your account. That is, you can borrow the full amount that is purchased. Now, this would seem a little bit silly and actually would be incredibly risky because people with absolutely no money could own an infinite amount of stock. Now, equity is your position value, which is the value of the securities, minus any borrowing, plus any additional cash. Now, this brings us to our second definition, maintenance margin. Okay, this is the minimum amount of equity before additional funds must be put into the account. So, the equity can fall in your account, but it has to fall a certain amount before you have to put more money in your account. Exchanges mandate a minimum of 25%, although some brokers may require higher maintenance margins. The margin call. This is the notification from the broker that you have to put up additional funds or have your position liquidated. So if an investor has $10,000 of equity in an account, they must maintain, for example, $2,500 in their margin account. If the equity rises to $15,000, then the maintenance margin rises to $3,750. That is 25% of the $15,000. Now, your margin percentage equals the equity divided by the market value. So, if the equity divided by the market value, that is the margin percent, is less than or equal to the maintenance margin requirement, then a margin call occurs. That is, you're asked to put more money into your account. And we can rewrite this as the market value minus the borrowed money, that's your equity, divided by the market value. If we solve for the market value, we can figure out what market value you'll have that will give you this margin call. So you take the amount that's borrowed and you divide it by 1 minus the maintenance margin requirement. So let's take a look at an example. Suppose Z Corporation stock price is $70. The initial margin is 50%, and the maintenance margin is 40%. You happen to have 1,000 shares. So that is, your stock position is $70,000. $70 times 1,000 shares. The amount you borrowed is $35,000, and the amount of equity you have is $35,000. Now suppose the stock falls to $60 per share. What's your margin percentage? Your margin percentage, again, is going to be the market value, which will be $60,000, divided into the amount of equity you have. The equity being the $60,000 that the stocks are now worth, minus the $35,000 you borrowed. So you're at a 41.67%. The maintenance margin requirement is 40%, so you're not going to get a margin call here. All right, you have sufficient funds in your account or sufficient equity in your account. How far can the price fall before the margin call? Well, if we take that 35,000, the amount borrowed, divided by 1 minus the maintenance margin requirement, we get $58,333. And if we divide that by the 1,000 shares you have, if the price falls below $58.33, you're going to get a margin call. So in this case, your new position is the stock is worth $58,333. If this were the case, you'd have $35,000 you borrowed, you'd have $23,333 in equity. If you want to restore the amount of equity to the initial margin requirement, that would be 50% of the value of your position, or you'd have to have $29,167 in equity. All right, so finally, let's talk about how margin affects return. So let's consider the investor who had 100 shares of a stock selling for $100 per share, which is $10,000 worth of stock. Suppose she decides to take advantage of the 50% margin requirement and purchases 200 shares of the stock for $10,000 and borrows the remaining $10,000. And let's assume that the rate on the margin loan is 9%. When you borrow money to buy the stock, you're going to pay interest on the loan. And in this case, we're going to assume it's 9%. So we're going to look at 3 different situations. Price rises by 30%, price falls by 30%, and price remains the same. So if the price rises by 30%, right, the value of the stock goes from $20,000 to $26,000. If you subtract out the amount of interest and principal you have to repay on the loan, we can calculate the return. And I've done so down here. 26,000 minus the amount of the loan, right, minus the amount of the initial investment, 10,000, divided by the initial investment of 10,000, that's 51%. Okay? So even though stocks only rose 30%, your return is 51% because you were using someone else's money. You were using the broker's money to buy more shares. If the stock price falls by 30%, right, so falls by $6,000 down to $14,000, we can calculate the rate of return as well using the same formula, right? The value of the stock position minus the loan amount minus the original investment divided by the original investment. Now you lose 69%. So even though stock price only changed by 30%, you lost 69%. So you can see how much leverage magnifies the gain and the loss. And if there's no change, then you simply lose 9%, which is the cost of the margin loan. If you didn't buy on margin at all, then your return would be 0. Right? So you can see that buying on margin works out really well if you're right. If you know the stock is going to go up or you project correctly, you enhance your return from 30% to 51%. But if you're wrong, you're going to lose a lot more than the stock price fell. So you've got to be careful when you use margin. All right, it can be effective for increasing return, but it also increases potential losses.